I'm Matt Downing, and welcome to Diving Deep EDU.
Curious conversations with all types of peeps. Encouraging innovation, we are diving deep. Certainly education is what we like to speak. Fervent with dedication, now it is time to teach. Yeah.
Welcome to Diving Deep EDU, and we are back at it with a focus for the next chunk of episodes, and we're going to be talking about change. Not just change in a general sense, but bringing about change within an educational setting, really within a school. And we're going to be doing that through the lens of organizational behavior, through different books, through different articles, through different philosophies of change. And many of these books, really most of these books, most of these papers, most of these ideas about change that we're going to be talking about weren't written directly towards the educational context. Some were, right? But most weren't. So we're going to be spending some time thinking about these deep thoughts, and then we're going to try to apply them to the K-12 educational setting. Right? We're going to be thinking, we're going to be considering, we're going to be reflecting, and we're going to be seeking to apply the things that we're learning together. And if you have any questions or comments, just send me an email, right? My email is in the show notes, and we're going to be featuring some of these questions coming up, maybe in the next episode or so, and I've got some good ones already. So if you have a question, you have a comment, just send an email and see my email in the show notes. And while you're at it, go ahead, leave a review, right? Spotify, Apple Podcast, all those things, and share this episode out. Let's get rolling. So the topic we're going to be considering today in respect to change is this: sacrifice is necessary. That's the topic of our conversation today, and that's where all of our thoughts and reflection and seeking to apply will focus upon. And this idea that I've come to reflect upon and I've come to realize and I've come to know to be true is a key factor in the change-making process. And this is something I've stayed away from, right? Personally, and when I've talked to others. So personally, right, I've tried to stay away from the idea that sacrifice is necessary when trying to bring about change. I might create a system, right? I might create a process. I might create something that would try to alleviate the necessary sacrifice when we try to bring about change. I'm not saying that we should stay away from systems and processes. I love those things. Right? I love to streamline, to think about, to change, but we're doing that to fix the process, to fix the system. We're not doing those things to alleviate a necessary sacrifice in the change-making process, and I've done that, right? I've tried to do everything I can so that sacrifice won't be required of myself, right? And as I've talked to others, and they're trying to bring about a change, I've guided them through the process in a lens that has been, okay, what can we do so that you don't have to sacrifice in this change-making process? And that's an error, right? That's an error in thinking. That's an error in going about change. So as I go about change, as you go about change, we can't try to approach change in the sense that, all right, I'll do this if I don't have to sacrifice, because that is false. In order to bring about change, sacrifice is necessary. And that's what we're going to be exploring in greater depth today. Now, let me make something clear. I'm not proposing a life of martyrdom when I'm talking about the idea that sacrifice is necessary when bringing about change. That doesn't mean that we all have to be martyrs, right? Have you seen Ethan Hawke's movie, First Reformed? If you haven't, you should probably see it. It's an interesting movie. You know, it's in my top list. Not the top movie, but it's in that bucket of interesting and insightful movies. But at the end, you know, Ethan Hawke's character becomes a martyr. And that's not what we're trying to do. We're not trying to do that through this change-making process. But sacrifice is not martyrdom, and sacrifice is necessary when we're trying to bring about change. And that sacrifice is going to look different. It's going to look different for you. It's going to look different for me. It's going to look different in different contexts, right? Sacrifice might be, sacrificing more time at work in order to get something done. Sacrifice might be my personal comfort to attend certain meetings that are different from the way that I approach things and the way that I think about things. Sacrifice might be through mental strain to do hard work. To do hard, focused work is difficult. And instead of scrolling the internet or doing menial tasks, you're going to approach this difficult task and accomplish that. And that requires a sacrifice. It might require sacrificing lunches at the office to make important sales calls, right? I got to make this extra call so I get this sales, quota, so I can get that bonus, so I can help us as a company achieve these goals. That's a sacrifice. And if we're going to change within our setting, within our context, we have to approach sacrifice not as something that we're trying to skirt around, not as something that we're trying to bulldoze through, but something that we recognize as a reality and we deal with it. And we're going to be looking at different articles that are going to help us think about this in a better way. The first article we're going to be looking at is a survival guide for leaders by Heifetz and Linsky. It's a great article, and it's a great launching off point in this conversation as we look at some different articles. And really their main point of this article is this: people resist change because of the losses connected to change. Okay? So let's think about that. People are not resisting change because they don't want change. They're resisting change because they don't want the loss that's connected to that change. Okay, so let's think about this within the K-12 setting. You might propose a new schedule for the school, and the staff is up in arms. They don't want it. It's probably not because they don't want a new schedule, because they're scared of change. It's because they're scared of the loss that's going to be associated with the new schedule. What will happen to their planning time? What will happen to their lunch time? Maybe the day will lengthen and it will impact them picking up their kids at their other schools and other obligations. So as we're proposing a change and, people are up in arms, they just don't like change anymore, they're stuck in their ways. That's a common refrain that people have when people don't want change, but that's not true, right? That's not reality. People don't want change because they don't want those losses that are connected to the change. So what are you going to do with that? How are you going to approach that? Are you just going to keep saying people are stuck in their ways, they don't want change, I can't believe this, they don't know how to innovate? The problem with that is you. The problem with that is the mindset that you're bringing to that situation. So instead of dismissing them because they're scared of a loss that's associated with the change, you have to speak into that loss. You have to speak into that loss in a way that opens up dialogue so that they can understand that that loss is not connected to that change. You got to disconnect the loss from the change. And how do you do that? Well, you allow time to process. You allow time for them to speak that loss into that change and understand that that loss is not a reality when that change takes place. So they have to understand that a change in schedule will not change their ability to pick up their kids at the end of the day. They're not going to have that loss with the change. They have to understand that a change in schedule will not impact their prep time. They're still going to have their prep time. Walk them through that. They have to understand that a change in the schedule might impact when their lunch is taking place, but you're still going to have lunch and you're still going to be able to have it with some of your colleagues. So let's look at the proposed schedule. Let's see who has lunch together. That's a big thing. People love eating together. It's a break from the day, and they really enjoy that. We can't dismiss that. You have to allow people to share the losses that are connected to the change and speak into them. Allow them to process those. And that's not going to be done quickly. You got to walk them through it. It's got to be a process in order for the change to be effective. So stop thinking they don't want change, they're stuck in their ways. That's the wrong mindset. Start thinking they want change, but they're connecting change to a loss, and I have to speak to that loss so that they understand they can walk through that change together and they're not going to have that loss. Then you're going to have people buying in, and you are going to experience the change-making process. It's going to be more effective. All right, so the second thing we're going to consider is really a philosophy of change from William Bridges. And he has a great way of approaching change and how people walk through the change process. And really boils it down to this. The first phase of change begins with when people identify what they are losing and learn how to manage their losses. They determine what is over and being left behind and what they will keep. This includes relationships, processes, members, location, all of these different attributes. This connects so well to the previous article because he says that the change process won't begin until we allow people to identify what they are losing and learn how to manage these losses. We have to help them through that. So from his philosophy, we're not doing any change. This change is not happening. It's an illusion unless we allow people to walk through these potential losses with change. It's essential. I wonder what he would say to the people that say, they're stuck in their ways. They just don't want to change. I imagine shaking his head and thinking, you don't have a clue. You don't have a clue what it takes to bring about this complex change-making process. This is not something that's dictated from on high and everyone just follows. That's not how it works within a complex institution like schools and within the business setting. And as an aside, business settings are thinking about change nonstop. And I've learned a lot as I've delved into the research on change, and most of it comes from the business world because they're doing this work and successful businesses are living this out. And as I look at K-12 systems, as I talk to leaders across the country, as I talk to leaders in different, districts and different states, they're frustrated. They're frustrated with the change-making process because it's complex and we need all of these parts. We need to learn from these experts, these William Bridges. What has he learned from the change-making process and what can we put in place to make this a reality, to name these losses? Because from his perspective, if we don't name these losses, if we don't give time to process, then this change is not going to occur. The third article I want to consider is an article from Michael Fullan, and it talks about the implementation dip, right? But this article, I've been reflecting on it a lot, and there's a couple different angles and there's different layers to this. So stay with me as we look at this article. So he talks about the implementation dip, and what he means by that is this. When you're trying to implement a new curriculum, there'll be a dip in performance. In one sense, you're kind of sacrificing performance in the short term for a new curriculum in the long term that's going to give you better results. Okay, and we've experienced that as a district, right? Across the state, across the country. When you go for a new curriculum, okay, there might be a little dip. In one sense, that's a sacrifice that you're giving to make the change a reality because you agree with the long-term vision that this will help us in the long term. So we're going to have a brief implementation dip. But here's where his research and his ideas add different layers, add more complexity, and I think add greater insight. He says this, that the dip is greatest, right? When you're going to a new curriculum, your performance dip is the greatest when you don't allow people to speak to the difficulty, speak to the sacrifice, speak to the hardship that's a result of this new curriculum. So who's the hardship on when we're implementing a new curriculum? It's the teachers, right? The teachers are putting in the extra work. The more planning, the more looking at the research, the more considering activities to do in the classroom. It's a lot. And that's why there's an implementation dip in performance. But it's greater, this dip is greater for districts that dismiss the sacrifice that teachers make. We don't consider, just, all right, keep the crying to a minimum, right? This curriculum costs a lot of money, we spend a lot of money. It's a great curriculum. So just be quiet. They're not going to say that to their faces, but that's what teachers feel sometimes, and if they feel that, what's going to happen to performance? It's going to be a bigger dip. What happens to performance when you allow teachers to speak their potential loss with change, right? As we've talked about in point 1 and point 2, speak that loss. Help them process through it. Understand that you're not going to be able to take that away because sacrifice is necessary when we're bringing about a change. It's a reality. Don't try to solve everything, but just because you're not trying to solve it, allow them to speak it, process it, help them through it, disconnect it to the change. And those districts, right, those schools experience less of a dip and greater long-term growth. And can't you nod your head to that? Don't you see that as a true reality? Because oftentimes when we're bringing curriculum, we throw it at teachers. They start complaining. We tell them to, kind of like, stop being a crybaby, those kinds of things. Even if we don't say it to them, that's what they feel. And as they feel that, they're not going to be able to walk through the change-making process effectively, and the performance will suffer. The students will suffer. The teachers will suffer as the leader does not allow them to speak about the sacrifice that they will have to endure as a result of this implementation. So it's really something to think about, and it connects closely to schools because Folln is one that writes about his experience in schools. All right, so the fourth and final article is this: leadership in a permanent crisis. And this article, is coming at it from a business lens, and it brings a really interesting perspective. It highlights that people will experience loss when change occurs, and this loss could be different. It speaks to removal of jobs, removal of familiar practices, even different loyalties they might have with a mentor or different colleagues. Different teachings may no longer apply, and how are you going to engage with that? And that's a sacrifice that people endure. One of the major examples it talks about is Kimberly-Clark. And Kimberly-Clark in the 1970s was faced with a really difficult and paramount decision. Do they leave the paper business? Right? Do they leave the paper business? That was the heart and soul of their company for, I think, over 100 years up to that point. Do they sell the paper mills? Do they get rid of their place within the paper industry? And they did. And that was a huge sacrifice for the entire business. And they positioned to Kleenex and other consumer goods. And that decision helped their company grow and outperform their financial objectives, their financial goals. They far exceeded them. But that wasn't an easy decision, because they had to look at these paper mills that were the fabric of their company. And they had to make the difficult decision: do we let them go? Right? Do we pivot? Do we go in a different direction? And that's not easy, because their whole company was built around these paper mills. That was their past. If you would walk into their headquarters, you would see pictures of these beautiful paper mills that have produced so much paper for the country, for the world, and that was who they were. But the leadership had to make a change. They had to sacrifice these paper mills. They sold them off. They had to pivot to a new direction, and it succeeded. I also want to point out that another point this article makes is that leaders themselves, must avoid sacrificing their well-being to the cause. I just want to bring that up because at the beginning, we talked about we're not martyrs. This isn't martyrdom. This isn't Ethan Hawke in First Reformed movie, towards the end of that movie. We're not doing that. And I appreciated that this article brought that out, because sacrifice is hard. It's hard for these businesses to make. But as a leader, as all people, we're encouraging emotional health, physical well-being, and that's crucial for living out change and for leading change. So we've looked at 3 different articles and 1 leadership philosophy. I think these have been really helpful to help us consider the necessity for sacrifice when we're bringing about change. We've looked at different perspectives. We've got different insights. But all of them say this: we can't avoid it, right? We can't be the way that I was trying to approach change. We can do change, but, sacrifice, let's push that to the side. Let's try to avoid that. No, sacrifice is necessary when trying to attempt a change-making process. But we have to speak to that sacrifice. We have to allow people to process the loss that's going to be with the change that's going to occur. Allow them to speak that. Allow them to process it. Allow them to disconnect it from the change that's occurring. And then you'll be able to live out the change that you're trying to bring about. So let's close our conversation thinking about application, right? Because all this is great. All these articles are great. All these philosophies are great. But what difference does it make if we don't apply it, right? So how we're going to apply some of these things that we've considered today. Well, the first thing I want to encourage you is don't sidestep sacrifice. Don't sidestep sacrifice for yourself, and don't sidestep sacrifice for others. Acknowledge the sacrifice for yourself and acknowledge it for others, and help them walk through that sacrifice. Help them speak it, help them disconnect it from the change process, and then take step by step by step. The next thing I want to encourage you is when you're attempting a change initiative, jot down these areas of sacrifice for yourself. It's good to think about it, right? It's good to reflect, but sometimes I keep things in my head, and it helps if you process it on paper. Write these potential sacrifices down, and then write how you are going to walk through it, how you're going to process that in connection with the change initiative. If you're bringing a school or a large group through a change initiative, an anonymous survey is great, right? But when you're doing this anonymous survey to get stakeholder feedback on potential sacrifices that they're feeling, potential losses that they're feeling with this change initiative, be careful of your language, right? Be careful of how you phrase that. They might not engage with the word sacrifice. They might not engage with the word loss because they might not want to acknowledge that this change initiative will require a loss for them or will require a sacrifice. They might think, you know what, I want to do this, so it's not a sacrifice, but that's not really true, right? So we might want to say something like, what's something that might be difficult for you? What's something you're worried about? What's something you would like us to consider? What's something that maybe we haven't yet thought about in regards to this change initiative? Ask a couple questions around it without using those words, and you're going to get much better feedback. And this will be great feedback, because if you get good feedback from this survey, you could allow time for them to process these ideas, these loss ideas as a group, right? When you bring the teachers together or the large group together and give them space, and then give them space to give feedback and ask questions in regards to this so that you can speak to that and you can help them through that so that you could walk through that change initiative with success. And that's what we want to do, right? That's why we're looking at these articles. That's why we're reflecting on this. That's why we're considering this, because we want to effectively bring about change. And let's end with that thought. And thank you for tuning in to Diving Deep EDU. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I did. Right? If you have questions, send an email, see the show notes, subscribe, share it out, leave a review. Until next time.
Wow, it's time to reflect. That's astounding. You've been checking out the podcast from Matthew Downing. Hope you like diving deep like a scuba diver. And the show provoked hope. That's our true desire.